Welcome back everyone to Fundamentals in Ecology. This is part 2 of the module called Ecosystems and Biogeochemistry. I am Shumanto Bakchi from the Center for Ecological Sciences at ISC Bangalore. So a quick recap of what we had covered in part 1. We looked at concepts and definitions related to ecosystems which provide an opportunity to study material and energy flow as an integrated part of the Earth system. So we looked at properties of the Earth as well and how they relate to the concept of different biomes. And many of these features were predictable based on the uneven distribution of temperature and precipitation around the world. And life is distributed unevenly, and if you look at the equator and go towards the pole, you'll see very vast differences in the types of organisms, types of plants that live in different places, and these differences are related to how temperature varies and how precipitation varies. This variation is due to the tilted nature of the Earth's axis, and life consists of a few light elements which are obtained from the atmosphere, and they are passed from air to living organisms and then from water and land. And one basic property of life forms is how monomers or basic building blocks are converted to polymers and then released back into the air as building blocks again. These processes operate at the cellular level. Each cell is doing the same thing, whether you are unicellular or multicellular, and these processes also operate at the scale of the whole planet. So we can provide a general template to understand how material and energy flows through the different parts of the planet using concepts derived from ecosystem science. Now plants are the ones who get these processes started, and then they are eaten by herbivores who release some of the molecules back into the atmosphere through respiration. Herbivores are in turn consumed by predators and carnivores. What is left behind is released as gases through fire, and if fire doesn't release everything, then the leftover material goes back into the atmosphere through the decomposers who work on the polymers and create building blocks again. And we also looked at some terrestrial and aquatic differences. So terrestrial ecosystems such as forests have large bodied producers and small bodied consumers, and it's reversed or it's inverted in water. So this is part 2, where we will touch upon a few more things about biogeochemistry, and here we will look at the Earth's chemical system. So there are two broad categories of the Earth's chemical system. One consists of the geological processes such as weathering, erosion, plate tectonics, volcanic activity, and so on. This is a big part of the Earth's chemistry. And then the rest is the biological part of the Earth's chemistry, which consists of life forms that catalyze certain reactions. These are usually jobs done by enzymes, and the main aspects of biological processes on Earth involve carbon fixation, nitrogen fixation, things related to the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and many a times these are symbiotic functions. So more than one organism participate together to obtain these products, such as carbon fixation and nitrogen fixation. Okay, this is something you would recollect from part 1, that life consists of chemistry of light elements. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you have hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and throw in a few metals, that's it. You should be able to understand what's happening in the biological processes involving life forms. The rest of the periodic table does not actively participate in the biosphere. So let's look at where these elements came from, or where do they come from. So if we go back in time, all the way back to time 0, the theory of Big Bang tells us that soon after the Big Bang, hydrogen was the first element to be formed, and there were traces of helium and lithium available. But almost all of the universe consisted of hydrogen. There was only just one element. The rest of the periodic table hadn't been created yet. Now, where did the rest of the periodic table come from? These came from stars. This hydrogen produced or went into stars, and in the core of these stars there is nuclear fusion reactions which created many more elements. So carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, all the way to iron. Stellar synthesis stops at iron, and the periodic table is still unfinished. We still have more elements beyond iron which have not been formed yet. So when a star reaches the end of its life cycle, it collapses and explodes into what is called a supernova, and this is where the rest of the periodic table is formed. So now we get opportunities for all types of chemical reactions to happen after the first star has exploded and planets have formed around the second generation star. Let's look at our solar system. Our sun is such a second generation star, and we are on a planet which is little way away from the sun. We have a large number of minerals available to us as well as gases. This is related to the density gradient created from this massive object here, and as you go away from it, you get the gas giants which are orbiting far from the sun. These consist entirely of gases or the light elements. The heavier elements are in the rocky planets that are closer to the sun. We are in this really remarkable place where we have the rocks as well as the gases. Okay, you don't see gas planets near the sun, and you don't see rock planets away from the sun. So the Earth is very uniquely positioned to have access to both minerals and gases. These minerals and gases are the building blocks from which simple chemical reactions give rise to opportunities for more complex life forms to emerge. So let's look at Earth in this long time scale. Let's imagine what the conditions of the primitive Earth would have looked like many billion years ago. So one way to understand the chemical processes of the Earth in its deep history is something that you are probably already familiar with. This is called the Miller-Urey experiment, where two scientists simulated primitive Earth conditions which consisted of a very different composition of the atmosphere. They created conditions of that atmosphere in laboratory bottles and tried to check if simple processes like heat and electricity and lightning can convert the atmospheric molecules into building blocks of life, such as amino acids and so on. So the Miller-Urey experiment helps us understand that even in primitive Earth conditions where the atmosphere consists of a different mix of gases, it was a reducing atmosphere, not an oxidizing atmosphere like it is today. The building blocks of life could have originated through simple processes. And then the next big innovation in the history of life comes when biochemical catalysis is found or is established. So these are catalysts which are enzymes, and they do a remarkable thing by bringing down the activation energy of reactions that are thermodynamically not easy to perform. So they bring down the activation energy, they give rise to the opportunity to have more and more complicated molecules to be formed. One such complicated reaction is photosynthesis, which allows plants that have the correct enzyme to use the energy from the sun through photolysis of a water molecule, and then the energy that is released by the photolysis is used up in rearranging the bonds of a carbon dioxide molecule and converting it into carbohydrate. Once you have that carbohydrate, it can be rearranged. The bonds of the carbohydrate can again be used to provide energy for further reactions, and eventually we got to a point where we have very complicated forms of life that depend on this original process which started with photosynthesis. Now photosynthesis does one more thing. It releases free oxygen because the water molecule has been broken down, the hydrogen has been used away, and only the oxygen remains. So from a reducing atmosphere, we get to a point where today we have an oxidizing atmosphere. We have a very large amount of oxygen in our air, and slowly as the oxygen from primitive plants built up, there was an event in geological history which is called the Great Oxidation Event, and from that point onwards we have more and more complex life forms evolving, and all the way to the Cambrian explosion with multicellular life forms. So last 500 million years or so, Earth has been running these chemical reactions where life forms interact with land and water and air, and things cycle back and forth. So there is a geological template, there are chemical reactions which are performed by biological entities. So now in part 1, I left you with a thought about what's the role of Earth's gravity or magnetic field in shaping the Earth's atmosphere as we know it today. So we have the Earth which has a certain mass, and it has a layer of thin air consisting of gases surrounding it. Now the Earth's mass is such that it allows it to hold on to these gases through its gravitational attraction forces. So if the Earth's mass was much smaller, then these air molecules would attain their escape velocity and would have been able to jump out and go away. So there is a critical role played by how big the Earth is, how large its gravitational attraction is, because it allows it to retain its atmosphere. These gases don't dissipate back into space, they are held together near the Earth's surface by gravity. The other major role that is played is by the magnetic field. So the Earth has a core which generates magnetism, and this magnetism helps deflect solar wind which comes and hits the Earth from the sun. In absence of this magnetic field, the solar wind would not get deflected, they would not go around the Earth, they would come and hit us directly, and they would wash away this atmosphere. So these gases would have been cleaned up by the solar wind, but they were prevented by the magnetic field. So between the effects of gravity and the magnetic field, the Earth sustains or contains an atmosphere which contains a very large mix of gases. So gases that are relatively light, gases that are intermediate atomic weight or molecular weight, and so on. But let's compare the conditions of Earth with another planet. For example, Mercury. Mercury is relatively close to the Sun, it's also a rocky planet, but it is much smaller in mass, has lower gravity, plus its magnetic field is not particularly strong, and given that it is its proximity to the Sun, even if Mercury had an atmosphere, today it is completely barren, it's just a bald, barren piece of rock, there is no air surrounding Mercury. Then look at Venus and Mars. Venus has lost most of the light gases, it has only the heavier molecular weights remaining. Mars is also a very thin atmosphere. We are in this Goldilocks zone where all the conditions converge and give us an atmosphere that contains many, many types of gases and in certain proportions. So the two that are particularly interesting in this module are nitrogen and carbon dioxide. This relates to the nitrogen cycle, and the other one relates to the carbon cycle. And between nitrogen and carbon, we can understand a lot of biogeochemical processes that happen. So let's look at nitrogen first. One thing that we need to notice immediately is nitrogen is the most abundant gas in our atmosphere. It constitutes about 78% of the total molecules in air. But an interesting thing about nitrogen is that it is available in its elemental form. There are two nitrogen atoms and they have a triple bond between them. Being a triple covalent bond, it makes this nitrogen molecule very difficult to react with. It's very, very inert, it doesn't react very easily. It's very difficult to manipulate this bond, make it react with something else. For example, make it react with oxygen to make nitrates, or make it react with hydrogen and make ammonia. So despite its high abundance in the atmosphere, nitrogen is still a very limiting resource for almost all forms of life. And this triple bond can be rearranged through a process known as nitrogen fixation, which is often used in relation to reducing elemental nitrogen into ammonia, adding hydrogen, changing its oxidation state, and rearranging the bonds. So in the Earth's history, in deep history, paleo-Earth conditions, the main form of nitrogen fixation was using the energy provided through lightning from the sky. Lightning is thought to be the original source of nitrogen fixation. Lightning has played a role in fixing nitrogen for a very, very long period in Earth's history. Later on, when biological life forms appeared, we get to a point where a remarkable chemical reaction shows up which can fix nitrogen through biological processes. So biological processes is a symbiotic relationship between plants and a microbe that they harbor in their roots. So you may be familiar with a type of plants called the legumes. These legumes have in their roots little nodules where microbes can go and live, and they provide anaerobic conditions for these microbes who contain a very specific enzyme that is able to manipulate the triple bond of atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into reactive forms of nitrogen. This is nitrogen fixation, and these bacteria are called rhizobia. Those nodules are also probably very familiar to you. The important thing to realize is it took two organisms to get this reaction accomplished. So it's a symbiotic product. Okay, there are some metals involved in this process as well. So the original nitrogen fixing enzyme contained molybdenum. Then we see life forms evolved into using iron and as well as vanadium. There are small amounts of nitrogen fixed by an alternative pathway called photooxidation. This uses light as the source of energy and not lightning. And then about 100 years ago, humans developed technological tools which could fix nitrogen using electricity. And so the triple bond was broken through electrical current, and that is the industrial nitrogen fixation that has been dominating the Earth's biogeochemical nitrogen cycle for about 100 years. Okay, so today more nitrogen gets fixed through the industrial process than by lightning or by biological activity. For billions of years, it was 3 types of nitrogen fixation, but suddenly the world changed about 100 years ago when electricity was available and the technology to convert atmospheric nitrogen to reactive forms of nitrogen has now become the most dominant part of the nitrogen cycle. Now there are some challenges associated with the nitrogen cycle and what humans have done to it. So the historical path of nitrogen is you start with air, microbes work on it and they produce ammonia. This ammonia can be transformed into amino acids, and then you can do various things. Once you get to this point, you can build plants, you can transfer these amino acids and convert them into proteins, and you can have complex chemistry afterwards. But then came something called the Haber process. This is named after, or the Haber-Bosch process, named after a person called Fritz Haber, who in the early part of the 20th century discovered the industrial procedure where electricity could be used to convert nitrogen into urea. Now urea can be spread in the farmlands and the croplands to produce a lot of food. So until the Haber process came along, human population was limited by the amount of nitrogen which could be recycled from manure or guano. So it was limiting to our population size, but not anymore. Human populations began to grow exponentially over time. As soon as food could be produced by converting nitrogen industrially. So there is now currently no upper limit to how many humans can exist, because we can produce food on demand. We just keep producing more and more urea, and unless we run out of land, we can just land and water or fertile soil, we can just keep converting urea into food and then feed a very large human population. So now all this human activity causes two types of problems with the nitrogen cycle. One is a lot of nitrogen escapes from our farmlands and enters the water. It's carried by the rivers and streams all the way into the ocean, where there's a sudden influx of this limiting resource that leads to algal blooms. Harmful algae, particularly cyanobacteria and some other types of algae, try to take advantage of this sudden influx of nutrients, and they have a boom in their population size. What it does, it uses up all the available oxygen, and then they suffocate and die. It also kills off all the fish and everybody else. So these are called oceanic dead zones. There's several places in the world's ocean where large rivers have brought back nitrogen from the farmlands, deposited it into the water, and now there's nothing alive. These pockets in the ocean are devoid of most forms of life. This has implications for biodiversity. This has implications for changes in the pH of the soil, changes in the pH of the water, and because some of these oceans or some of these areas were historically important for fisheries, they also have consequences for food security and livelihoods. The other aspect of the nitrogen cycle is atmospheric deposition of N. So human activities release a lot of oxides of nitrogen into the atmosphere. This is something that I will cover in a subsequent slide in a little bit more detail. And these oxides of nitrogen come back to ground when they get dissolved in droplets of rain. So the rainwater brings back reactive forms of nitrogen and causes eutrophication of terrestrial ecosystems as well. So that also has consequences for biodiversity, because the moment you change the availability of a limiting resource, competition, facilitation, and many other interactions involving living organisms also get altered. Main concern about nitrogen deposition is when nitrogen is deposited in large quantities, it allows the dominant species in a community to overtake everybody else. So you generally see a loss of biodiversity in places that have very heavy amounts of nitrogen deposition from the atmosphere. Another thing about nitrogen is that it ultimately gets recycled by microbes in the soil, and when these reactions run their full complement of reactions, when they start and when they run from start to finish, you get release of dinitrogen from the soil. But sometimes these reactions are incomplete, and some intermediate products such as nitrous oxide, these escape from the soil into the atmosphere. Now nitrogen in this form, N2O, is extremely potent as a greenhouse gas. It has much more warming potential than carbon dioxide when it reaches the air. And so if soils are leaking nitrogen oxides, then that's very bad news for global warming. The other problem with N2O is that it's very, very stable, it's very, very inert. Once it reaches the atmosphere, it does not readily convert into some other form which has lower global warming potential or is less harmful to warming. So N2O is one big problem about the nitrogen cycle because it has such high warming potential. Okay, let's look at carbon. There are certain similarities and dissimilarities between the cycles of carbon and nitrogen. One interesting difference is that carbon dioxide is the main form that it is available in is double bonded. So it's not triple bonded, it's two double bonds. double bonds are generally easier to manipulate. So carbon dioxide, even though it's not a highly reactive molecule, it is more reactive than two atoms of nitrogen. Okay, and then manipulating this double bond, reducing it into hydrocarbons, is the process that we called carbon fixation. And the main reaction that does this is photosynthesis. Here, the initial energy input is provided by sunlight. This energy causes photolysis of water, breaks water into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen goes into the oxygen comes out, and then the hydrogen is used to reduce to create reduced forms of carbon. In nitrogen, it was symbiosis between two organisms. Here also you can think of it as a form of symbiosis, because these chloroplasts or plastids that live inside a plant cell and run the reactions of photosynthesis are actually thought to be endosymbionts. So these used to be free living bacteria which merge together to form a complex association. So here again it takes two participants to accomplish the reaction. There are many variations of the photosynthetic reactions, but here are three major types. C3 photosynthesis is a series of chemical reactions which involve tricarboxylic acids as the intermediate forms of reduced carbon. So these are acids which have three carboxylic groups. C4 photosynthesis is a variant of C3 photosynthesis where the reactions are started using a 4-carboxylic acid, a 4-carbon carboxylic acid, and these 4 are later passed on into the C3 mechanism. There's another variant called the CAM pathway, crassulacean acid pathway. This is not as common as C3 and C4, and it is found in plants that live in extremely arid, hyperarid conditions where water is an extremely limiting resource. So the major evolutionary innovation that led to the evolution of C4 from C3 is actually a decline in atmospheric CO2 levels. So many millions of years ago, due to plate tectonics, the continents were not in their current location. The ocean circulation was also different, and the geological part of biogeochemistry of the earth had reduced the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, primarily through weathering of silicate minerals and deposition of carbonates into the ocean floor. So there was a drop in CO2 levels, and it became harder for plants to trap it, and the evolutionary innovation that arose during this time was C4, which is better able to work at low carbon dioxide concentrations. A byproduct or a side advantage of C4 photosynthesis was that it also makes the plant more efficient in terms of using water. So water use efficiency also goes up. So C4 plants did very well in geologic times when CO2 level was low, and they also spread into the areas of the globe where water is not available in high quantities, so drier regions. So these are the grasses. Many grasses are C4, although C4 photosynthesis has evolved independently in few other types of plants. So grasses are familiar to us as savannas and grasslands which occur in drier regions compared to forests that have trees using C3 pathway. So those were the similarities between carbon and nitrogen. One big difference is that unlike nitrogen, we do not have the technology or the tools to do industrial carbon fixation. So the Haber process could take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into something. We can't do that. Although there's a lot of research being done on replicating photosynthesis in the lab or in various settings, we don't have a very clear parallel example of industrial carbon fixation. If we had, it would probably help us clean the atmosphere in some way, but unlike industrial end fixation, We do not have industrial C fixation. So we'll get to this in one bit. So let's look at what are the challenges associated with the carbon cycle. Well, one, we don't have this. We don't have a way to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fix it into something else. But what we do have is an emphasis on research to decarbonize the atmosphere, which is take carbon dioxide and prevent it from remaining in the air and put it in some other pool. So you can do some more reading yourself about what are the different ways in which scientists around the world are trying to decarbonize the atmosphere, because as CO2 levels accumulate in the air, it causes a problem of rising temperatures. Now the problem started with the Industrial Revolution, which allowed humans in the 1700s to fuel industries using fossil forms of carbon. So this was carbon that was fixed by plants in the Carboniferous or the Devonian period, and these plants did not decompose. Instead, they got buried and became fossilized. So they became coal, they became petroleum. Since then, we have been digging this fossil stock of carbon, oxidizing it, using the energy to run our vehicles, run our industries, do everything that we do as modern humans, and release the CO2 back in oxidized form into the air. As more and more of the carbon from the fossil pool accumulates in the air, it traps more and more of the Earth's radiation, the long wave radiation, and that creates a warmer atmosphere. So we have warming potential. Every molecule of CO2 traps a little bit of long wave radiation, and together many molecules of CO2 make the whole planet a little warmer. Now a warmer atmosphere or warmer air also means that soils get warmer. Now there are microbes living in the soil that are respiring organic matter, breaking down the polymers and releasing CO2 back into air. So more of the organic matter comes out from the soil, and this CO2 accumulates in the air. More CO2 accumulates in the air, which makes the air warmer again, and then you get this positive loop. This is called positive feedback. The warmer the air, the warmer the soil, more the respiration, warmer the air. Another problem associated with the carbon cycle is that some of this warming is happening in places that have historically been under permafrost. So they were frozen, and the organic matter in these soils was trapped under ice or frozen forms of water. And as the planet warms, this ice is melting and the permafrost is thawing. And because there was anaerobic conditions in these soils for very long, instead of releasing oxidized forms of carbon as CO2, these places release reduced form of carbon as methane. So methane, again, just like nitrous oxide, is a very potent greenhouse gas. So small quantities of methane in the atmosphere have the same effect as large quantities of CO2. So that's another problem associated with the carbon cycle, and it's because of these positive feedbacks between warming, carbon release, which further creates more warming. These feedbacks are broadly called land-atmosphere feedbacks related to the carbon cycle. Okay, let's do a quick recap of what we have learnt about the relationship between biogeochemistry, ecosystem ecology, and climate. We know that we have a problem because we have been releasing a large amount of carbon dioxide from the fossil pool into the atmosphere, which makes the atmosphere warmer. The CO2 is able to trap Earth's radiation to increasingly high levels. So the atmosphere has already warmed up in the last 150, 175 years. The land has already warmed up in that period, but because of higher specific heat of water, the oceans are catching up. So they are not as warm as they would be if water did not have its thermal properties. So the oceans are lagging behind. They are going to catch up with the atmosphere in the coming decades, and that would strengthen these positive feedbacks and make them even stronger. So if a warmer atmosphere, the oceans are warming, the amount of soil respiration done by microbes is releasing more carbon dioxide into the air as a result of this feedback. Now warmer air also strips land of its soil moisture content, so it sort of dries out the land, dries out the soil. One associated negative impact of that is increasing the areas that we associate it as deserts. So desertification, creation of new deserts or expansion of deserts at the edges of existing deserts, that's another issue. You may have also heard of El Nino events, which is pockets of warm water somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, and there's a cyclicity associated with it. Every few years there's warming of a chunk of the Pacific Ocean, and because of teleconnections, warmer Pacific leads to impacts in faraway places such as India, where it affects how strong our monsoons will be. Will we have a normal monsoon or a below average monsoon? El Nino events are getting stronger. They are also getting more frequent and erratic. When the ocean warms up and has these extremely episodes of very warm conditions, it bleaches out the coral. So the coral is a symbiotic organism between an animal and a plant. The coral bleaches, which is the word used for the loss of this symbiotic association. So the algae, which is the symbiont, it dies or it's expelled from the coral, which means that the most productive ecosystem in the marine domain does not function properly for the next few years, and it's very difficult for coral to regrow because these El Nino events come more frequently than the rate at which the coral can recover. It also leads to extreme weather that we are becoming very familiar with. So there are floods which are becoming, so we get extreme heavy rainfall events every monsoon. So we have seen them in the Himalayas, we've seen them in the Western Ghats. So excessive rainfalls within a very short period of time. On the opposite, we are also noticing extreme drought, so excessive lack of rain as well as very heavy rains. Floods cause many types of disastrous consequences, landslides, loss of property, loss of life. These droughts also cause devastation. A few years ago, Australia was so dry that a very large part of the whole continent or the country caught fire. So huge tracts of Australia burnt in 2019. Now, as the oceans get warmer, cyclones have more energy that they can extract from the warm water when they pass over the ocean. So the cyclones in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal are getting more frequent, more powerful, and more damaging. Another aspect that is related to these biogeochemical changes in the atmosphere is spread of disease in areas where they did not exist before. For example, there were parts of the world, especially in high elevation or high latitude, where it was too cold for mosquitoes to complete their life cycle in the summer. So the summer was relatively short, and then it became cold and the mosquitoes could not live in those places. But now, because the temperature on average has increased, mosquitoes can complete their life cycle in such places. So many temperate cities or even high elevation cities now have a mosquito problem and everything that is associated with disease brought on from mosquito bite. So we have a large many consequences and implications for altering the biogeochemical or the chemical properties of the planet. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this part 2. So things for you to think about next could be maybe explore the concepts of circular economy. to put it in very simple terms, when the byproduct or the waste of one sector becomes the raw material for another sector, then, and if you keep doing this, then the economy circulates materials very effectively without producing any waste. This is in a way mimicking how the earth system works, that one thing goes into another form, then comes back and then keeps going again. So maybe there are lessons from earth system science for how we handle resources to run economic activities. Also maybe look up efforts related to carbon neutrality, how to make industry carbon neutral, how to make economies carbon neutral, how to make countries carbon neutral. The efforts can start at an individual level, at the level of your family, at the level of your community, at the level of the state or the nation or the world as a whole. And for instance, changing the yellow filament bulb, the one that Edison invented, to the modern ones that are LED is a big step towards reducing everybody's carbon footprint. Taking the bicycle instead of your scooter to school or college is one step. Using public transport instead of private transport, that dissipates the carbon footprint among a large number of people than entirely to an individual. Those are all steps that can be taken by individual people, those can be taken by industries, corporations, governments and so on. And then also try and think of the challenges in improving the way we run our economies if we happen to be a developing country versus a developed country. What are the differences in these two domains of how the world is. Okay, so thank you. So this brings me to the end of the module about ecosystems and biogeochemistry. Thank you.